Winston Churchill pressed both fists against the edge of the map table, his gaze fixed on a single line carved in blue ink across northern Germany, the Rhine, the last wall, the last river the Third Reich still claimed as its own. Somewhere beyond that line, 1,000,000 Allied soldiers waited coiled, loaded, ready for a signal that had not yet come. March 23, 1945. The war rooms beneath Whitehall, London. The air underground was thick with smoke and tension, heavy with the weight of decisions that would shape the end of the war. Footsteps echoed faintly against the concrete corridors. Then an aide entered without a word, placed a telegram flat on the map table before the Prime Minister, and stepped back into silence. Churchill read it once. He read it a second time. The cigar smoke drifting from the ashtray was the only thing moving in that room. And when he finally looked up, the 3 words he spoke were so quiet, so precise, so absolutely devastating, they didn't need to be repeated. Everyone present understood. In one breath, the most celebrated British general of the Second World War had been reduced to second place, and he wasn't even in the room. If you're new here, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight. Every view keeps these stories alive, and I want to know where history finds you. To understand what those 3 words meant, you have to understand the 2 men Churchill had been watching for years, not just as generals, as philosophies, as competing answers to the oldest question in warfare. Do you wait until the conditions are perfect, or do you move before your enemy expects you to? Bernard Montgomery had been answering that question the same way since North Africa. You wait. You prepare. You assemble an overwhelming force so complete, so suffocating in its scale, that the outcome is decided before the first shot is fired. Montgomery had built his entire reputation on that answer, and it had worked. El Alamein, October 1942. Montgomery faced Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, the finest armored force in the German military, across the western desert. He had 195,000 men, 1,029 tanks, and 530 aircraft. He spent weeks stockpiling supplies before he fired a single gun. The battle lasted 12 days and broke the Afrika Korps permanently. It was grinding, costly, and methodical. It was also a triumph that made Montgomery's name ring from Cairo to London. Churchill had pinned an entire empire's pride on that name. By 1945, Britain was no longer the dominant force in the Allied coalition. America was supplying the war minus $50 billion in Lend-Lease alone, 300,000 aircraft produced between 1940 and 1945, more steel in a single month than the Reich produced in a year. British manpower had peaked. American divisions now outnumbered British formations, 4-1 on the Western Front. Montgomery was Britain's proof that it still mattered at the table, that British military thinking, careful, methodical, certain, was still shaping the war's outcome. Operation Plunder was supposed to be the final argument, the Rhine crossing that would seal Montgomery's place in the history books forever. Planning had begun in January 1945. Engineers surveyed the northern Rhine near Wesel, where the river ran wide and cold, over 1,500 feet across in places, current strong enough to flip an assault boat in seconds. Montgomery demanded everything: ammunition stockpiles built over 3 months, pontoon bridge components staged behind the tree lines, 2 entire airborne divisions, the British 6th and the American 17th, held in reserve for Operation Varsity, a coordinated drop behind German lines timed to coincide with the river assault. Over 3,500 artillery pieces, 60,000 tons of supplies pre-positioned, nearly 1,000,000 men ready to move on his command. Montgomery called it the largest set-piece river crossing in the history of Western warfare. He wasn't wrong, but 200 miles to the south, another man was staring at a different stretch of the same river, and he wasn't thinking about perfection. He was thinking about tonight. George Smith Patton, Jr. didn't pace. He moved. He had been moving since the summer of 1944, when his Third Army erupted from the Normandy breakout and turned what was supposed to be a grinding campaign of attrition into something that looked disturbingly like a cavalry charge conducted with Sherman tanks and artillery. In 11 months of combat command, the Third Army had advanced further and faster than any American formation in history. 600,000 soldiers, 12,000 vehicles, racing so fast across France that Patton's own supply lines couldn't keep pace, and he pushed forward anyway. He believed in a single principle so completely it had become almost theological. A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week. He had written it, spoken it, and lived it across every battlefield he had commanded. Speed was not recklessness. Speed was the weapon. A paralyzed enemy couldn't reinforce. A surprised enemy couldn't concentrate. Every hour a commander spent preparing was an hour he surrendered to his opponent. Montgomery represented everything Patton found philosophically intolerable in a senior commander: slow, cautious, demanding of resources before he moved. Patton watched plunder being assembled with barely concealed contempt. Eisenhower had given Montgomery the primary Rhine crossing, the main effort, the historic moment, the glittering prize. That decision had not sat easily with Patton. He hadn't built the Third Army into the most mobile force on the Western Front to watch from the sidelines while someone else claimed the killing blow. So Patton did what Patton always did. He looked for a door that wasn't on the map. His reconnaissance teams moved quietly through late February toward the Rhine near Oppenheim, south of Frankfurt. What they reported back was remarkable and, in hindsight, entirely predictable. The German defenders in that sector were shadows of a fighting force. The 6th SS Mountain Division and elements of the shattered German First Army had been ground down by weeks of Allied pressure. No coherent defensive line, no significant artillery coverage. The Germans had concentrated their best remaining forces in the north, where every intelligence assessment and every logical calculation told them the blow would fall, where Montgomery was massing in plain sight. The southern Rhine wasn't defended. It was merely occupied. Patton absorbed the reconnaissance reports in silence. He ran the numbers not through logistics tables, but through instinct honed across 3 years and 4 campaigns. No bombers, no smoke screens, no airborne divisions, no preparatory barrage. If it went wrong, there was nothing to save it. If it went right, the Third Army would be across the Rhine while Montgomery was still counting his ammunition. He made the decision on the morning of March 22, 1945. Tonight? The darkness over Oppenheim that night was complete. No moon. March cold pressed down on the Rhine's surface, and the river moved fast and black beneath it, indifferent to what was about to happen on its banks. Engineers had staged assault boats behind a tree line, moving them up by hand to avoid engine noise. The men of the 5th Infantry Division crouched in the shadows, rifles cold to the touch, saying nothing. Sound was the enemy. Noise meant discovery. Discovery meant everything coming apart before a single boot touched the eastern shore. At 2,200 hours exactly, the first boats slid into the water. No artillery cracked the sky. No bombers thundered overhead. No smoke rolled across the surface. Just wood on black water and soldiers pulling oars through a current that wanted to carry them sideways. The eastern bank was dark. No muzzle flashes. No searchlights. The German defenders in that sector, scattered and disorganized, hadn't anticipated this. Not here, not now, not without the thunderous preparatory fires that every logic said had to come first. Patton had bet everything on that miscalculation. The boats hit the eastern bank. American soldiers poured forward into the darkness and through scattered, confused resistance that never had time to consolidate. The fighting was close and brutal and ugly in the way all riverbank fighting is all shadow and sudden violence. But the bridgehead held. Engineers rushed in immediately, working through the pre-dawn hours under fire, laying pontoon bridges across the current. By first light, the structure was solid, and before the sun cleared the horizon over Germany, American tanks began rolling east across the Rhine. Patton drafted his report to Eisenhower's headquarters, within hours of the bridgehead being secured. The language he chose was deliberately flat, military in form, clipped and factual. But every word had been placed with surgical precision. The Third Army, the message stated, had crossed the Rhine at 2,200 hours on the 22nd of March, 1945, without benefit of aerial bombing, ground smoke, artillery preparation, or airborne assistance. Read it once, and it sounds like a routine operational update. Read it twice, and the blade appears. Every resource listed, the bombing, the smoke, the artillery, the airborne troops, was exactly what Montgomery had spent 3 months assembling in massive quantities 200 miles to the north. Patton wasn't reporting a river crossing. He was writing a 1-paragraph verdict on Montgomery's command philosophy, without ever using Montgomery's name. The message traveled up the chain to Eisenhower's headquarters, then forward to London without delay. Churchill was in the war rooms when the telegram arrived. He read it once, the way he always read bad news, slowly, giving the weight of the words time to land fully. Montgomery was still north of the Rhine. Operation Plunder had not yet begun. 1,000,000 men, 3,500 guns, 2 airborne divisions, all still waiting, all still staged, all still counting toward a crossing that had not happened. And Patton was already across. Churchill understood immediately what this meant on every level. Militarily, the Rhine's crossing had been achieved without the set-piece battle everyone had been building toward. Strategically, Patton's bridgehead gave Eisenhower options no one had planned for, but it was the political and historical dimension that landed heaviest in that room. Montgomery was Britain's general. Plunder was supposed to be Britain's moment, the signature campaign that would write the British Army's name onto the closing chapter of the European War. Instead, an American general operating on instinct and darkness had crossed the Rhine in a single night with nothing but soldiers, boats, and audacity. The irony was almost unbearable. Montgomery had argued repeatedly, with complete conviction, that crossing without overwhelming preparation was suicidal. He had built an entire argument and an entire command culture on that belief. Patton had answered it with a single night's work. Churchill's response, recorded by those present, did not fill the room. It barely occupied a breath. 3 words. Quiet as a verdict. Patton beat you, that was all. 3 words directed at the absent Montgomery. 3 words that collapsed months of planning, years of reputation, and a lifetime of carefully defended philosophy into a single sentence of unambiguous defeat. No elaboration was needed. No one in that room asked him to explain. On the night of March 23, 1945, Montgomery's guns finally opened. What followed was, by any objective measure, spectacular. Over 5,500 artillery pieces fired simultaneously along the northern Rhine near Wessel, a bombardment so enormous it was visible from 50 miles away, a second sun rising horizontally across the horizon. Bombers filled the sky. Operation Varsity launched 16,000 airborne troops, the British 6th Airborne and the American 17th Airborne, in a single day, the largest single-lift airborne operation of the entire war. Assault boats hit the river in coordinated waves. The northern Rhine erupted in the most precisely orchestrated military crossing of the 20th century. By every conventional measure, it succeeded. Every objective was seized, every bridgehead held, every timetable met. It was everything Montgomery had promised, flawless, overwhelming, certain. But it was no longer first. The German defenders in the north had 24 hours to hear about Patton's crossing, reposition reserves, and steel themselves for what was coming. The element of surprise that might have reduced Montgomery's casualties had already been spent 200 miles south. His men crossed against a defense that was ready. They crossed successfully, but they crossed at a cost that a surprised enemy would not have exacted. And 200 miles south, Patton's Third Army was already driving deep into Germany. His bridgehead at Oppenheim had expanded into a flood. German formations that had never expected pressure from that direction folded under the impact. Every hour Montgomery had spent staging plunder, Patton had converted into miles of advance, miles of disorganized German rear area, miles of ground that no defender had been positioned to hold. By the time plunder was underway, Patton was already past the point plunder was trying to reach. The front wasn't bending anymore. It was breaking. And it had broken in the south first. Eisenhower drew his conclusions quietly, the way all great command decisions are made, not in dramatic confrontation, but in the slow, administrative language of redeployment and reallocation. Montgomery's role in the final drive into Germany was progressively narrowed. His authority over American formations, which he had held at various points throughout the campaign, was reduced. The grand vision he had carried for years of leading the decisive final thrust into the Reich was handed to others. There was no public humiliation. There didn't need to be. The record spoke for itself. Montgomery went on to command his forces through the final weeks of the war with professional competence. He accepted the formal surrender of German forces in northwest Germany, Holland, and Denmark at Lüneburg Heath on May 4, 1945, a historic moment that history has often overlooked in favor of the larger surrender 3 days later. He was knighted, honored, promoted to field marshal, celebrated. His career, by any external measure, ended in triumph. But a reputation is not a career, and reputations are written at the moments that matter, not in the ceremonies that follow. The Rhine had been the moment that mattered. Here is the part of the story that deserves honesty. Montgomery was not wrong. His caution was not weakness. His insistence on preparation had won battles and saved lives at El Alamein, in Sicily, in Normandy. His method had a logic rooted in the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare, in the knowledge that men who crossed unprepared died in larger numbers, that rivers didn't forgive improvisation, that the Rhine was not the kind of obstacle you attempted on instinct alone. Operation Plunder succeeded, every objective achieved, every timeline met. By every conventional standard, it was a triumph. But war doesn't grade on conventional standards. War rewards outcomes, and outcomes belong to the man who moves first. Patton understood something that Montgomery's training and temperament would not allow him to accept. That preparation, pushed past a certain point, becomes its own kind of risk. That the window of advantage closes while you are still loading your artillery. That the enemy you are meticulously preparing to defeat is also simultaneously preparing for you. That sometimes the greatest danger is not the river in front of you, but the hours you surrender to it. The cold Rhine had always been less a barrier than a mirror. It reflected the character of the men who stood before it. Montgomery stared into it and saw the risk of failure, and built an answer so overwhelming that failure became impossible. Patton stared into it and saw something different. He saw an enemy that had stopped watching. One man assembled a cathedral. The other kicked down the door. Both built something that lasted, but only one of them built it before the other man woke up. History remembers the Rhine as Patton's, not because Montgomery failed, and not because plunder wasn't spectacular, but because the first man across the river writes the sentence that opens the chapter. And on the night of March 22nd, 1945, in the cold darkness over Oppenheim, with no artillery and no bombers and no smoke and no plan except forward, George Patton wrote that sentence in the only ink that has ever mattered. Speed. Churchill's 3 words did not invent that verdict. They simply acknowledged what had already been decided the moment the first American boat touched the black water of the Rhine and no gun answered from the far shore. Patton beat you. 3 words. The shortest military review in the history of the war, and the one that echoed the longest. Because in every war, in every century, across every river that has ever divided men from victory, the question is always the same. Are you building something perfect? Or are you crossing tonight? The Rhine doesn't remember the guns that prepared to fire. It remembers the boots that were already on the other side.